'cause we get around. Talking about my generation. They do look awful.
Thank you, Kane, so much. I'm so delighted to be here with all of you today. And I'm mostly delighted because I get to shout out the incredible Ace Hardware store in Kent, Connecticut. When I was on vacation with my family, Christmas week, we walked into our rental house to an infestation of ladybugs. Did you know that was a thing, that ladybugs can have an infestation? Not only was the Ace Hardware store in Kent, Connecticut open, which nothing else in the area was, but they helped us with our problem. They are a Pinnacle performer. They are not here today, but is anyone here from the state of Connecticut? Anyone to an adjacent state to Connecticut? Thank you for being there in my time of need. I am here, of course, to talk about generational diversity, and the topic is really great because nobody doesn't want to talk about their age in front of all of their colleagues in a big boardroom at a conference. But my favorite thing about generational diversity is you are all experts because we are all members of multi-generational families. And the reason that this topic has extended into our workplaces is for the first time in history, we now have 5 distinct generations all working together. The traditionalist or World War II generation, the baby boomers, the largest generation ever born into the United States, Generation X, with which I identify, millennials, also known as Generation Y, and the newest entrants, Generation Z. As I mentioned, my favorite thing about generational diversity is we all know and experience this every day. What people often don't realize, though, is we're not a 5-generation workplace for the first time because young people are growing up and coming in. That's always happened. The reason that we are 5-generation stores and offices and environments is because people are working longer and later into their lives. Of course, the generations do keep on coming. You may have heard Generation Alpha is the next group to come along. We were not very smart in the generational field. We had X, we had Y, we had Z. We ran out of letters of the alphabet, so they have decided to name them Generation Alpha, but they will be coming along soon as well. My least favorite thing about the generational topic, as you may have already done in your mind or when you saw that we were going to be talking about this today, is it often immediately leads to stereotyping and criticism, as we often see in the media. So if you are a baby boomer, you might have been told that you would never live up to the greatest generation. If you're an Xer like me, we were called the baby bust after the baby boom. We were called slackers and told we all had to move to Seattle and wear flannel and drink black coffee. If you're a millennial, where are my millennials in the room? Millennials? Millennials? Congratulations, you are a member of the most shamed and stereotyped generation in human history. Not because we said anything about you millennials that we didn't say about all generations before you, but we now have the internet and social media to criticize you. I want to read you the words on that light blue Time magazine cover to make sure you get all of the criticism about millennials. It says, millennials are lazy, entitled narcissists who still live with their parents. I think it's just missing our favorite stereotype that millennials want trophies for participation. And now here comes Gen Z, and immediately we have started to stereotype them. If you remember back to the early days of the pandemic, March 2020, who was one of the first groups that we criticized and blamed for the spreading of the pandemic? The college kids on spring break in Florida. We do this again and again and again as people come in. And we've all experienced it. The grandparents telling us, I walked uphill both ways to school. In fact, I was just at a company, and it was the first day of work for all of their junior employees. They were right out of college. First day, I was giving a talk on adapting to the workplace, and I was mingling around before the talk, and I heard these first day employees kind of grumbling. And I heard them say, I heard they're awful. They have a terrible reputation. They have no work ethic. Everybody's criticizing them. We were so much better. And I walked over and said, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I heard you talking. Isn't this your first day here? And they said, yes. And I said, who are you talking about? And they said, the new interns. The minute we have power, the minute we have authority, we turn around and criticize the next group. I thought it'd be fun to ask if you can possibly place this quotation from all of those eras we talked about. I see no hope for the future of our people if they are dependent on the frivolous youth of today. Any guesses? Could be from this morning's paper. Baby boomers, maybe earlier, like the flapper generation in the 1920s. In fact, this is from the 8th century BC. We've literally been shaming young people for all of human history. And what I'm here to talk about today is not that this isn't a very nice thing to do. I want to make the point that it's actually a business and professional mistake. Generational diversity, the 5-generation workplace, the associates you have from every generation reflect the customers that you have from every generation. Instead of seeing this as a problem to overcome, a challenge to defy and struggle with, my goal is that we use today as a chance to see this as an opportunity. If you are the store where people all feel included and celebrated for their age, you will get the best talent of every generation. Your customers of every generation will want to come to you. I really believe, particularly coming out of the pandemic, that the organizations, the stores, the individuals who see every generation as an asset are going to win, and the ones who insist on living in the past or throwing away the past to change for the future are not going to succeed. So we're going to talk about this in 3 areas. I'll go over each of the generations so we have an understanding of who they are. We'll talk about some trends of what really has changed over time. How different are each of the generations and how similar? And then a lot of takeaways for you to fill your toolkit with different ways to be a leader in a multi-generational environment. So I've already thrown out a lot of generational terms. I want to define them for you. Here are the 5 generations in the workplace today, and we're at a really unique moment going into 2024. The traditionalists are only about 3 or 4% of the workplace. Think Rupert Murdoch or Warren Buffett, that generation. But the boomers, the Xers, the millennials, and the Zs are all about 20% of the US population. So we're at a really interesting moment for each of those generations. We often define generations by the birth years. This is how the Pew Research Center defines it. Although the baby boomers, born between 46 and 64, are the only generation to be officially designated by the US Census Bureau. Everything else has been deduced from there. But I want you to look at a couple of other things other than age as you're thinking about your associates and the people that you know. The first is generational size. It is almost impossible to explain just how big and dominant the baby boomer generation has been in our country. I mentioned we're about 20% of the population for each of the big 4 groups, but baby boomers are still more than 50% of congresspeople in our country. They're still more than 50% of Fortune 500 CEOs. They're still more than 50% of governors of states in America. If you are a Gen Xer or even an older millennial, it's hard to explain how much of a baby boomer world we have grown up in and still often live in today. But even more than age and generational size, what I think is most important for you is when each generation first entered the workplace. What was their very first day having a boss like? What was their very first day dealing with customers? What technology did they expect to be available to them? And I'll give you an example. I mentioned that I'm a Gen X. I was born in the 1970s, the era of a lot of brown, of wide ties. You can see the appearance of the Cabbage Patch doll in the bottom right-hand corner, all of the markers of being born in the 70s, growing up in the early 80s. But I don't think that is as impactful to how I see the world as a professional as the fact that I started my first job in the 1990s, the era of frosted hair, of pantyhose, of a file of facts you can see there in the corner, lots of really kind of embarrassing .com logos. It was the time of the rise of email. It was the time of the rise of Silicon Valley and entrepreneurship. And in fact, Gen Xers are the most entrepreneurial of all of the generations. So when I think of how I work, when I think of what my expectations are, I think more of what the workplace looked like when I started than things like what TV shows I watched when I was growing up. I think the group that entered work for the first time during COVID is probably its own micro-generation in and of itself. So as you think about your associates, as you think about other vendors and colleagues that you work with, think about when they started work. There's also a concept called micro-generations, which are people which you might feel looking at those numbers who don't really feel like they fit into the generational categories. And there are three of those. We have the Generation Jonesers, who are sort of younger boomers, older Xers, who feel like they don't really fit in. Maybe their older siblings were baby boomers, and they never felt like they got all of the joys and the advantages and the economic opportunity of being a baby boomer. There's another group called the Zennials with an X. Zennials are kind of younger Gen Xers, older millennials, who kind of feel like they have one foot in each of the generations. The key marker of a Zennial, if you're trying to categorize yourself, is that your first video game was Oregon Trail. Does that resonate with anyone in the room? Oregon Trail. It wasn't like one of these cool games like Roblox or Fortnite. You were basically pressing 2 buttons on your PC and getting dysentery and told that was fun, right? Then you have the Zillennials, who are kind of younger millennials, older Gen Zs. What I think is interesting about micro-generations is we have a tendency as people to want to find our cohort, to want to find the people who share the culture that we grew up in. And if you identify with one foot in one generation and one foot in another, like a Zennial, I think you're kind of have a superpower. I think that you are bilingual. I think that you're probably really good at dealing with people older than you and really good at people dealing with younger because you've done that your whole life. And I think this is where we're going. If we have this conversation 5 or 10 years from now about generations, I think we're going to smaller and smaller cohorts because technology is changing so fast. What used to be 15, 18-year runs of people having a lot culturally and technologically in common, I just don't think is the case anymore. And in fact, in Asian countries, they go by decade, children of the 70s, children of the 80s. I think that we're going to go more toward that in the future. And of course, we now have Generation Alphas who are about 10 years old and younger. Their first experience with the workplace has already happened. What was it? They watched their parents either work from home during the pandemic lockdowns or be told they were an essential worker and have to go out and work in a really scary time. I think that's going to impact them for a very, very long time in the future. So think about your own store. What generational mix do you have? And I thought it might be interesting to see who we happen to have in this room today at the Pinnacle conference. So if I can ask you to raise your hand as I say each generation, including the micro-generations, a couple of ground rules. Raise your hand for what you feel, even if it's not when you were born, and I want you to feel free to just lie if you feel like you should. Okay, so do we have any traditionalists in the room? Traditionalists? Anyone whose career was heavily influenced by a traditionalist? Still a lot of people with mentors who are in the traditionalist era. Baby boomers in the room. Where are baby boomers? Woodstock. Do you know Gallup did a study that more people say they were at Woodstock than could have possibly been within 100 miles of Woodstock because they want to identify and there were no cell phones, so we can't guarantee it. Okay, Jen Jones. Anyone identify with Jen Jones? Yeah, I feel kind of caught in the middle. Where are my Gen Xers? Gen Xers. A lot of Gen Xers in the crowd. I'm not surprised. We're business owners. Zennials. They're my Zennials. Oregon Trail. Okay, terrific. Welcome. Any straight-up millennials? Straight-up millennials. You'll get your trophies later. Thank you. Zillennials. Anyone feel caught between, got a couple of Zillennials in the room? Do we have Gen Zs in the crowd today? Gen Zs, welcome. I was just at an insurance conference in Philadelphia, and when I asked for Gen Zs, the only people who raised their hand were the AV guys in the back of the room. So congratulations, Ace Hardware, for having Zillennials. And anybody have Gen Alpha children or grandchildren? Any Gen Alphas? Okay, so we have all the generations represented. This is a true multi-generational environment. So a really good study of what is happening in the overall workplace today. I do want to mention, age is not the only factor of who you are. I am not suggesting that you leave here today and walk up to the next person you see and say, how old are you? And then decide how to treat them, nor should we ask employees. There are so many factors: functional knowledge, gender, race and ethnicity, veteran status, country of origin. So why talk about age? Why is it so important today? In my opinion, generations give you a sense of people's shared experiences and the expectations they bring when they walk through your door. Recent example is inflation. How many of you, raise your hand, have been through a period of inflation before in this country? Raise your hand if this was your first time. That's a different experience. You have either seen it before or you have not. You have an expectation of what will happen based on your experience. What technology do you expect to be handed to you? What level of women in leadership do you expect to see? It's different in 1950 than it is from today. So I wanted to share with you 3 different trends that I think are helpful to explore when it comes to what has changed so much over the course of the past 50 years or so. And I picked 3 that I thought would be relevant to this room: licensed drivers, technology, and community belonging. We'll start with the driver's license. Raise your hand if, like me, you were online at the DMV the day you turned 16. Why? Freedom. I want my driver's license. I want to get out. I want to see my friends, right? Why then, Xers and baby boomers, has the share of 16-year-olds getting their driver's license dropped by half since the 1980s? Why don't 16-year-olds want to get their driver's licenses anymore? Uber and Lyft, sure, sometimes they call for rides, close with their parents, gas is expensive, they're worried about burning fossil fuels, all of that is relevant. But what is the #1 reason young people say, I don't need a driver's license? Because of their phones and the internet. I don't have to leave my house anymore as a teenager to see my friends. I don't have to leave my house anymore to flirt. I don't need to leave my house anymore sometimes to work, to study, to play games. So much happens on my phone. Who has a tween or a teen in the crowd? I have a 12-year-old. It is no longer a punishment to send them to their room. The room is the command center. It's a punishment to make them leave the room because they get so much from their devices. But the desire, the freedom that you called out is human. So younger people today may not get their driver's license, but they want freedom in other ways and in other places. Freedom of self-expression, freedom of believing in causes they care about, freedom of the flexibility to choose their career paths and how they work. The freedom we share, the way it comes out in our experiences is very different. #2, technology. And of course, when you talk about technology in the year 2024, we have to talk about the fax machine. Gen Z, where are my Gen Zs? I put a picture for you, just so you would know. I asked in a crowd the other day how many people had had a BlackBerry, and all these young people raised their hand, and one came up to me afterward and said, I thought you meant the fruit. It's true. So fax machine, why am I sharing this? I was at a company, one of my clients, and a Gen Xer peer who had started her career at a law firm in the mid-1990s said to me, I feel sorry for young people today because they don't get to send faxes. And I said, you're gonna have to explain that to me. And here's what she said. She said, when I was a young lawyer starting out in the mid-1990s at a very big law firm, I knew nothing. I had no skills that my bosses didn't have. And one of my jobs, she said, was to fax contracts to our clients. And if you remember the days of fax machines, they were big, huge devices in the center of an office, and you would have to send each page one at a time. And then it would beep, yes? And she would send thousands and thousands of pages a day of faxes. And what she said was, while I was standing there at the fax machine in the middle of a busy law firm sending faxes, there were no cell phones. Email was very early. She said, the whole time I was standing there, I would overhear more senior people talking on the phone and talking to each other. And they were negotiating, and they were chatting, and they were talking to clients, and they were arguing with vendors, and they were having difficult conversations. And for hours and hours and hours and hours a day, I heard how they communicated. Number two, she said, while I was standing there, people would walk by, and they would chat with me, and they would say, what are you working on? And we would get to know each other. We didn't have to schedule a 15-minute coffee chat or Zoom meeting. We were all in the office. We didn't have other things to look at. I was standing in the middle of the room, and they would get to know me in an authentic way. Number three, she said, it was boring when nobody was talking on the phone and nobody was walking by and chatting with me. I had nothing to do. There was nothing to look at. There was no phone in my pocket. I couldn't listen to music, so what did I do? I read every page that I faxed. In those days, the learning of how to communicate was all around. The relationship building just happened. The learning time was hours a day. Now, how do you send a contract to a client? All of that is gone. When Xer peers and baby boomers and traditionalists say things to me like, nobody taught me how to communicate in the workplace, I just figured it out. No, you didn't. You were surrounded by it all the time without asking for it. Nobody had to send you to a training course to do it. What became clear to you and obvious was because you were immersed in it. Everybody wants to know that they are doing a good job. I have never, in 20 years of doing this work, had anyone tell me that younger people aren't as smart as older generations. But what they say over and over again is they seem unprepared for the conversations, for the customer service, for what we thought was common sense. These things only become clear when you are taught them. And so we have to know that everybody wants clarity on how to communicate and how to work and how to be. We just didn't need to used to have to teach this stuff. And now we do. Number three, community belonging. I was at a nonprofit. I was very moved by Chris's story. I do a lot of work with the Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York City. And I was working with their fundraising development team. And some of the younger fundraisers said they were often really confused because some of the baby boomer and traditionalist donors to the hospital would call and ask for a membership card. And they said, I can send you an email. And a lot of the traditionalists in particular said, I don't want an email, I want a card. I want to be able to show people that I donate to something I care about. I want to feel that sense of community, of membership, of belonging. And that was sort of baffling to the younger employees. And I started looking at some of the data on membership in Girl Scout and Boy Scout troops, in membership in churches and synagogues and other religious organizations. Any Rotarians in the room? I went to grad school on an ambassadorial scholarship. Thank you for all of the work that Rotary does. Well, memberships are down significantly in Rotary clubs as well. I had a Gen Z in a focus group say, I don't generally like to belong to groups that have more than 10 people. This desire for individuality, for self-definition, has changed a lot, again, because of the internet, because we can stratify into these tiny groups. But the desire for connection, the desire to be seen, is so critical. What I noticed Gen Zs in particular telling me as community belonging has gone down is how much they crave belonging at work. And it's not belonging to a brand. It's not belonging to the Ace Hardware family as much as it is belonging to the people they work for. A lot of students and recent grads tell me, I don't know if I'm loyal to a brand. Brands change all the time, but I'm loyal to my mentors. I'm loyal to the bosses who care about me. The desire for human connection used to be to big organizations. For a lot of young people, it's really about connection to individuals, but the human desire for connection is there. So what I want you to think about from these trends as we move into the actions to take is I think we're more alike than we are different. We all want freedom, but in different ways. We all want clarity, but in different forms. We want connection, but it means different things to different people. So what do we do about that? I want to fill your toolkit with lots of different ideas for how to implement this in the very small ways and also the very big ways. And I want to start with two overarching kind of umbrella themes, and then we'll get to some nitty-gritty takeaways. The first is, I recommend that you, as owners, as retailers, as leaders, consider yourself to be a perennial. You are the age you are. There's nothing we can do about that. But you can choose to be a perennial. The term was coined by Gina Pell, who's a technology entrepreneur. And what a perennial means is two things. You know and share your history. This is what came before. I want other people to know the best of what makes my generation who it is, of who we are. 100 years of Ace Hardware. What happened in the past? What's the story? Share it. And number two, to keep up with the times. How do you make sure that you maintain the best of the past while adapting to what's available in the present? I'll give you a simple example. I spoke to an architect who said he learned how to design with a pencil and paper. Of course, in the 1980s, he started to use CAD design software like everybody did, and most students are taught that today. But he makes sure to teach all of his employees when they come in as junior architects how to use that pencil and paper, because there are some situations where that is still valuable. Know your history, keep up with the times. Number two, a term that I created in 2019 with a book I wrote called The Remix. Remix songs, as we all know, are songs where you take a classic, a great song, and you don't say, wow, this song is kind of getting old. We should never play it again. We say, this is a fantastic song. It's a classic. It's great. But there's so many modern artists and modern instruments and modern technologies. Why don't we remix it a little? And I didn't want to use the term remix without speaking to producers and DJs, and I was interviewing a DJ, and she said, when I play a wedding, which is almost always a multi-generational event, and the dance floor is empty, she said, my little trick is to play a remix, because the older people at the wedding recognize the classic song, and they feel included and come and dance, and the young people know the remix, and they feel included, and they come and dance. This is not an either-or situation. This is not who wins when there's a conflict, the boomer way or the millennial way. Think and, not or. Here's an example, employee benefits. In a lot of corporations, the gold standard employee benefit is a 401k retirement contribution match. I was working with PricewaterhouseCoopers, the accounting firm, and they started looking at their data on their employee benefits, and they found that their millennial employees were not taking the 401k match. And they wanted to know why. And this next conversation happened in my head. This is not real, but I imagine there was some kind of big high-level meeting, and the leadership said, why are these millennial employees not taking our match? It's supposed to be the best benefit. And I imagine one of the leaders said, well, because they're lazy, entitled narcissists. And then I imagine somebody else saying, maybe we should ask them why they're not taking the match. My millennial friends, why would millennials perhaps not be putting away money for retirement? Where was their money going instead? Student loans, the most indebted generation in American history. They wanted to put money towards retirement, but they had to pay off their student loans first. So PwC became the first company in the United States to say, as an employee benefit, we will give you a choice. We will either match your 401k retirement contribution, or we will match your student loan repayment, or you can have a little bit of both. And it wasn't just the millennials who took the student loan match. Who else was it? Their parents and their grandparents who were living in multi-generational families and wanted to support. Think and, not or. How do we make the pie bigger? Let's apply that concept of and, not or to 3 areas where there's sometimes conflict and challenges and opportunity in work environments. I want to talk about career development, communication, and culture. We'll start with career development. How people think about their careers, particularly for those of you in family-owned stores, the people who are not in the family. How might they perceive what their career path might look like? So I'm on an airplane a couple of years ago, and I'm sitting next to a young guy. I'm sure you've all learned never to tell anyone what you do on an airplane, because it turned into a 3-hour coaching session for this particular millennial. And he said, I'm frustrated and I need some advice on my career. He said, I'm an ambitious millennial. He was in sales for a big consumer packaged goods company. And he said, I want to get promoted, I want to move faster, I want to move up. My boss keeps telling me to slow down, relax. Your career is a marathon, not a sprint. And this millennial said to me, fine, my career is a marathon. What mile am I on and how fast am I going? Because nobody will tell me. How often do we make assumptions about how long people should take to get promoted? Whether they want to get promoted at all, what job they want next. When you think about career paths, we often assume everybody wants the next job, the next promotion, when they might not. You might have a 25-year-old who really wants work-life flexibility and is very happy to work part-time and doesn't want more hours. You might have somebody who is 75 years old who wants to work double time and is super enthusiastic. You might have somebody who wants to get promoted but never wants to manage other people. I get the question a lot. I'm a young person managing somebody older. Often older employees are thrilled they don't have to be the manager. Don't assume that somebody is unhappy with that situation. Make sure you talk to people about what they want. Action 1, have what are called stay conversations. Informal, transparent conversations with an employee to say, what career path is interesting to you? What are you looking to do? What's exciting for you? What kind of flexibility do you need? What would you like to learn how to do? The reason they're called stay conversations, and they're not a promise, but the reason is to avoid the exit interview. Because how often does somebody quit and say they're leaving, and you say, why are you leaving? Well, I'm going to this place. They said I could do that. You could have done that here, you say, and what do they respond? Nobody told me that. Nobody ever asked me what I wanted. Stay conversations. Second action, really simple. In one-on-one conversations with any generation, let the employee, let the associate talk first. What's on your mind? What can I do for you? When you let them talk first, they guide the direction of the conversation. I do a lot of individual coaching, and the first thing I always say is, how do you start a meeting? Well, I tell the employee this, I tell the employee that. Let them go first. Simple change, every generation appreciates it. And the third tip for career development is to think about the remix of mentoring. Mentoring is one of those classics. It's wonderful. An older, Yoda-like experienced person gives you their knowledge, guides you on the path of life. But in a multi-generational environment, that's not always enough. What if the conversation went both ways? Keep the mentoring, but what if the mentee mentored the older, more experienced person in return? Estée Lauder Companies, the big financial giant, their CEO Fabrizio Freda decided to get himself a reverse mentor and assigned all of his top 250 executives to each have a reverse mentor who had to be a first or second year employee at Estée Lauder Companies. Once a quarter, the reverse mentor, the junior employee, goes shopping for makeup with the senior employee. Best job ever. Because what could be more important to a senior executive of Estée Lauder Companies than understanding how a young person shops for makeup? Doesn't mean the older person isn't more experienced and has a lot to give, but the younger person has ideas and suggestions too. I worked with a CEO who was very resistant to this. He was very old-fashioned. He did not like the idea that young people would bring any ideas to him and his leadership team that he didn't know already. He said, I will not do this. And he was having a lot of retention issues. And I said, well, would you agree to have a meeting with your junior employees and hear their thoughts? And he said, fine, but I'm doing it at 7 o'clock in the morning because they won't show up. And they did show up. And he had the meeting. And he debriefed with me afterwards. And I said, how did it go? And he said, it was terrible. I hated it. It was awful. And I said, why? And he said, because they had good ideas. Remixer rule, never assume, always ask. Never assume what somebody wants in their career. Never assume what's bothering somebody. Never assume someone is unhappy with a situation. Just ask. If you feel resistant to this, like that CEO, think about the expectation of society today. After you ride in an Uber, what are you asked to do? Give it a rating. After you buy something on Amazon, what are you asked to do? Give it a rating. I was at the bathroom at JFK Airport, and what did the bathroom ask me as I walked out the door? How was your experience? It was fine, but I had to press a button to say so. So if everywhere else in society you are being asked, what do you think? How do you feel? What do you want? How did it go? And your boss is not asking you that, there's a huge disconnect in your experience. Number two, let's talk about communication. One of the biggest issues I hear is young people wearing their headphones when they are repacking boxes, when they are working on spreadsheets. And the boss says, I can't talk to them, they've got these big headphones on, who told them that was okay? And I say, have you asked them? And when you ask a young person, why are they wearing their headphones at work, what do they often say? It helps me concentrate. I go faster, I'm trying to be more efficient. In most cases, not all, but in most cases, the goal is to do a good job. But if we don't have the conversation, you get resentful that they've got the headphones on because they're not paying attention. They think they're doing nothing wrong. We have to talk about what is expected when it comes to professional communication. Most people say this is where they struggle the most with generational differences at work. So here's the tool. Talk about how you communicate. Have what's called the style conversation. We're gonna be working together. Here are some of my preferences. I worked with the head of a sports league. She came on as commissioner of the league and she had a meeting with her whole team and she said, okay, here are the ground rules. Here is when you can email long messages that aren't urgent. If something is really important, we're gonna text, but we're only gonna text for important things. And if something is life or death urgent, that's when I want you to call my cell phone and I guarantee you I will pick up because we have set the rules in advance that is when we use each other's cell phones. ChatGPT, generative AI, everybody's talking about when do we use AI? What is AI? I was at a company and I said to the bosses, have you talked to your employees about whether they can use AI when they're writing emails to your customers, when they're writing official documents, when they're doing marketing for your website? And they said, our employees don't use AI. So I said, can we do a little experiment? And we sat down with the employees and I said, how many have used ChatGPT at work? And how many raised their hand? Every single one of them. Talk about how you want to communicate. What is expected, what is okay, what is not. On your leadership team especially, you might even consider what are called personal user guides. Here are the times of day when I'm available. Here are my preferences for what technologies to use. When you're in the leadership position, you have the right to tell people, you know what? I don't really like to text, I'd rather you come and talk to me. Think about when you're available. A lot of employees say their hardest issue is to get their boss's attention, is to understand when to talk to them, what tool to use to communicate, so tell them. But here's the final tool, and this is so important. You have to define your terminology. I'll give you some examples. I worked with an administrator at a college, and he, trying to be really kind and generous to his students, said, "You guys call me anytime." And so what happened? They did. They called him at 2 in the morning. They called him at 3 in the morning. And now he says, "I love you, call me anytime before 11 p.m. Another company said, "The real problem with our millennials and our Gen Zs is they're abusing our vacation policy. They're abusing our vacation policy. They take too much time." And I said, "May I see the policy?" And the policy, I kid you not, said take an appropriate amount of vacation. Another boss, "Problem with my employees, they're terrible writers. They don't know how to write. Their writing is awful. Doesn't anybody teach writing these days in the school system?" And I said, "How are you mentoring them?" And he said, "I tell them to write better." Now, what he's done is collected 50 examples of what he defines as good writing. And when a new associate comes on his team, he hands it to them as a document in a PDF and says, "I want you to see how I define good writing. This is what it looks like to me." What does come in early mean to you? What does appropriate dress mean to you? What does better mean? What does done or finished mean? The definitions might be different than what we were taught or what other people expect. I find a lot of people are resistant to this. I don't want to be bossy. I don't want to be too specific. But the reality is clear is kind. It's the not knowing that is frustrating and challenging for all generations. I get a lot of questions about return to office in environments where people worked remotely during the pandemic. And what I found is sometimes people's preferences align with generations. Maybe younger people like to use the technology, older people want to be in the office, but that's not really true. Everybody has different preferences. But here's the one fact that is true when it comes to any element of workplace flexibility, whether it's being in the store or being in the office, whether it's work hours. What people say they want, even more than the hours or the flexibility that's their personal preference, is they want clarity of what the policy is. Use your judgment, do what's appropriate is not clear, and therefore people don't know how to succeed. Statistics show people would rather have work hours or environments that are not what they wanted, as opposed to having a lack of clarity. Clear is kind. And finally, the last topic is work environment culture. I want to share the story of something that happened at KPMG, another accounting and professional services firm. I heard this story from my colleague, Zach Mercurio, who has spoken at some Ace Hardware events in the past. KPMG, for many years, was always listed as the least successful of the big four accounting firms when it came to employee satisfaction. They had the most unhappy employees according to studies and surveys. And they didn't think this was fair. So KPMG, in 2015, implemented something called the Purpose Project. And what they did was they said to all of their employees, write on this card the purpose of your work. Not your job title, not your responsibilities, but what is the greater purpose of the work that you do? And you can see some examples here. The one in the middle was an IT guy. And he didn't say, I turn your computer off and on, I fix it when you mess it up. He said, I stop cybercrime from getting into our company. That's my ultimate purpose. That's why I do what I do. The young woman who said, I keep jobs in the USA, shouldn't say I work and do math on a spreadsheet all day. That's my greater purpose. You can see there's a little silver button in the middle called the 10,000 Stories Project. KPMG's goal was to collect 10,000 stories. They had about 25,000 employees. They collected 40,000 stories the first month. People were so eager to share what their purpose or purposes were. The year that KPMG implemented the Purpose Project, they went from number 4 out of 4 in the Big Four in employee satisfaction in Fortune's 100 Best Companies to Work For list, all the way to number 1. So I'm telling this story about 6 months ago, And a guy comes up to me after sitting in the audience and he says, Lindsey, I was a partner at KPMG when we did this project. And this is like your biggest fear as a professional speaker, that you're telling a story to illustrate a poignant point and you're wrong. And he said to me, I have to tell you, as a partner at the firm, I thought this was ridiculous. I thought it was the dumbest idea I had ever heard. I rolled my eyes, as did most of the partners. And he said, you know what? We were all wrong. It worked. Not only did employees feel proud to say what their purpose was, not only did their scores go up in all these national ratings, he said morale was up, and at the beginning of individual meetings, people would say, what's the purpose of this meeting? Why are we really here? The why is so important to every generation. We hear that young people want purpose in their work. That's sort of the talk of younger generations. But every employee wants to feel that their work matters, that they matter. Every single generation. So how do you make everybody feel like they matter? What if they're the most junior person? What if you're a family-owned store and they're not part of the family? Number one, you make every committee or meeting or planning session as multi-generational as you can. The hospital that I talked about, Sloan Kettering, they were having a fundraising event. And they said, should we have a sit-down ballroom dinner or should we have a cocktail party for our younger donors? And they decided to have a multi-generational committee decide what event, and what did they come up with? Well, why don't we have both? Because a lot of the younger people said, I've never been to a sit-down dinner. I would love to experience that. And a lot of the older people said, all I go to are sit-down dinners. I want to come to the cocktail party instead. And because they had everybody at the table, they were able to come up with solutions that mattered. I think people ask too little of their employees when it comes to culture. We don't want to bother them. I think people want to contribute. People want to be part of solutions. One of the ways to do this, to be very specific, is to do a project called 100 Paper Cuts. This comes from engineering. I've also heard it called pebbles in shoes. What are the tiny little things that just irritate people, that they want to fix? And we as leaders often think we have to come up with the solutions. Flip it. Assign it to a multi-generational team. I'm sure there's lots of little things that bother you. Tell me what they are. And then tell me what you would do. I'll give you 2 examples. I was working with a small organization. Morale was down. Since COVID, nobody spent time with each other. People were eating lunch at their desks. And they were really frustrated by it. And the leader didn't know what to do. She had tried everything she could think of. And she had a committee come together of all different generations and said, figure out this morale problem. Come up with solutions. And by the way, your budget for this project is 0. And they came back to her and they said, well, you know the little conference room that we have in our office? You know, we don't use it very much. It's always busy for meetings. But what if from 12 to 12:30 every day that became the lunchroom? And we all could sit in there together. Anyone who wanted to be there could, and anybody who didn't have to. Great. Problem solved. Small changes that make a really big difference to employees. The events that nonprofit had were ideas that came from the employees. I worked with a summer camp, and the counselors had really low morale. They were really frustrated. They didn't feel like they got enough breaks. And of course, the leaders thought, oh, they have a terrible work ethic. Young people today don't want to work. But instead, they asked them, what are some problems we can solve? One of the problems, as I'm sure you can guess, is they wanted to use their phones. And they knew, of course, they couldn't use their phones when they were with the kids at the camp. But they said, could we at least move the lockers where we put our phones closer so that when we do have a break, we can have access to our phones? Absolutely, done. 100 paper cuts, pebbles in shoes, small problems that can be solved by employees. And number 3, next time you have a project, next time you have a goal, next time you have anything, talk about why. What is the bigger picture? And is everybody aligned with that? The Ace Hardware store in Kent, Connecticut didn't just help me get rid of some ladybugs. They made me feel safe in a vacation home. They helped me take care of my family. They were available when nobody else was. That's the purpose, not the spray that they sold me. Many of you probably know the famous story of NASA in the 1960s during the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. President John F. Kennedy is touring the Space Center, and he's introducing himself to everybody around, and he meets a janitor, and he shakes hands with the janitor, and he says, "What do you do here at NASA?" And what does the janitor say? "Mr. President, my job here is to put a man on the moon." Everybody wants to feel that their work is building toward a greater purpose. As a leader, focus less on the how with your employees and more on the why with your employees. So when we're talking about career development, what people want when they work for you, how can you give them more freedom to choose the situations, the promotions, the path, the learning that they want? When you're talking about communication, how can you provide more clarity of what needs to happen, how it needs to happen, and how people can be successful? And when we're talking about community belonging, how can you, in your culture, build the feeling of connection that people have with each other, with you, and with Ace Hardware? As a little bit of a homework assignment for all of you, I'd like to invite you to do one thing today, which is to have a conversation with somebody of the generation that you feel you spend the least amount of time with. Can we identify my Gen Zs again in the room who might be a little bit bombarded afterwards? Thank you, Gen Zs. Will you be available for consultations with the crowd? Maybe some TikTok videos, some Travis Kelce informational? Okay. Talk to somebody. My 12-year-old daughter is now a Kansas City Chiefs fan. That is the power of Generation Z and TikTok for all of you for Taylor Swift. Continue the conversation. I would be delighted to continue the conversation with you. I have several free courses on LinkedIn. One is called Managing a Multi-Generational Team. If you connect with me on LinkedIn, I will make that free for all of you here today. I want to say a big thank you to Ace Hardware for making this topic a priority in your conference, for inviting me to speak here today. And as promised, I'd like to offer all of you a trophy for participating in a session on generational diversity. Thank you very much.